I am one of the founders of ThinkNimble. Our goal is to make sure that our founders can, let's see, all right, there we go. We're screen sharing now. I think we're good to go. Our goal is to help founders of startups, nonprofits, other organizations really hone in on what they're trying to build and use modern technology to build those outcomes. So our consistent goal is to help our founders figure out what should they be building and why. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today focuses around the what to build. I think, when it comes to building a project on a budget, there are quite a few ways to scope down what you're building, but the best way to stay on budget is to really just focus in and build only a few things at a time and to build those things really well. And so a lot of what we do at ThinkNimble is help our founders think through what should they be building and how can they build that in the most efficient way possible. And that is one of the best ways that we have found to actually stay on budget as you're launching a project. So as we get started here, I'll run through the phases that we typically have with all of our companies that we run through. And if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them into the chat and we can run through them kind of at the end or as we're going here today, and hopefully we'll get everybody's questions answered. So I think ThinkNimble, one of the things that we really focus on with our founders is defining a hypothesis for your product. So a lot of times founders come in with the idea that they're going, you've kind of pitched this 100 times to VCs, you're talking about the pie in the sky ideas, and you're really excited about the end product, but that end product might be 5 years from now, it might be 10 years from now. It's sort of a big picture. And what we have our folks do is walk backwards to outcomes that are achievable in the next 6 months, maybe the next year, and figure out how to really specifically hone and test those options. So we call that hypothesis definition here at ThinkNimble. And the idea is that your entire business should be centered around one specific hypothesis, and your sales should be working towards that, your marketing should be working towards that, and your product should be working in that direction as well. So there are 3 ways to define your hypothesis and 3 ways that we ask our founders to think through really making sure they're building the highest leverage piece of their product first. The first is that you should be defining your outcomes. So you should be optimizing your highest leverage KPIs. The second is you should be removing bottlenecks from your production side. So whatever it is that's taking the most time. And the third is to build to the delta that you've promised to investors. So for the first outcome here, you guys do this all the time in other pieces of your business, but quite often in product, this gets left on the wayside. And so one of the things that we like to do is to focus in on business KPIs from a product perspective and think about whether the features that you're building are actually moving the needle on those KPIs. So I have an example at the end of this document, but we've been working with a client who is attempting to revolutionize the way funerals are planned. And there are a couple of key things that they need to prove to see if their idea will work. The first being, will someone access this tool online? And so if you start with a really clear hypothesis, like users will come to an online portal to plan a funeral, you can decide whether features help move the needle on those KPIs really directly. And that can really help you hone in on whether or not it's important to build a feature. So for example, if you're looking at, whether you can quickly transition a vendor from prospective vendor to fulfilled vendor, that doesn't necessarily help you test whether people are coming to your site, but implementing something like Google Analytics to see your churn rate on different pages really does help you analyze and move the numbers on that KPI. And so every feature that you lay out in your product roadmap should tie back to one of the overarching features that you are trying to push forward as a business. Alongside that, one of the ways to identify those is to identify bottlenecks in your current process. So as you're going through your current process, there are pieces of the business that you can do manually, right? There are pieces that you're picking up the phone and calling vendors. There's clients that you are back, kind of like hacking together a solution for. But there are pieces that you can't do without technology, or pieces that are taking you so much time that if you could do them repeatedly, you would find a lot more scalability out of them. Those are typically the best places for you to get started with your technology build. And this will help you really start to scope down the budget that you can spend, because you'll say, look, if I change this one thing about the way our process works right now, I could easily produce 5 to 7 times the amount of revenue that I have. And if you can specifically focus in on that piece, maybe everything else isn't as important. And so that helps you really figure out which is the high priority for your budget and which isn't. And that's one of the best ways to stay on budget over time. And then the last piece about a hypothesis is to really think about what the investors that you have on board are already seeking and build to accelerate that outcome. So we talk to our founders a lot about getting your investors also aligned with that hypothesis and having them come along a journey with you. So as you go in to raise a round of funding, you might have investors who are seeking 10x returns, 2x returns, et cetera, right? But what they're really coming in to do is to test something specific with you in service of a larger goal, which is usually their exit. So when you have them aligned with your product roadmap, with your sales roadmap, with your marketing roadmap, building towards that acceleration point really keeps your investors happy. It keeps them motivated towards the same goal as your team. And it helps make sure that all of the ships are kind of sailing in the same direction. So we ran a product here at in DC about 5 years ago called Aspire. And our goal was to help HR technologists better provide non-traditional perks and benefits to their employees. So we built a custom software that connected vendors to different groups in the area, and we provided catered lunches, happy hours, wellness programs, etc. So one of the things that we did when we were raising our Series A was that we told all of the investors, this is what our outcome is for Series A. We believe that if we can get 5 companies in 5 new cities with more than 500 employees at them, that we can scale this nationwide after that. And so everything we did was targeted at those 5 cities with the 5 companies. And our goal was to make sure that they didn't churn and that they stayed on track. And so everything in our product was focused on getting and keeping those companies. And because of that, our investors were also aligned with that goal. And so we were able to really easily keep our product on budget, because we knew that if anything came in about vendors, that was pushed to the backlog. If anything came in about management of feedback, that was pushed to the backlog, right? Our only goal was to produce better outcomes for those clients and to seek and move the needle on those clients. So if you can hone in on the delta that your investors are seeking and align that across the board with your hypothesis, that will really help you figure out what to build and why, and that can make sure that you stay on budget and on time. So that's the first section that we like to talk through. And here's an example of what that can look like as you're going through to build this yourself. So we typically take our clients through a series of questions like, who are we? Why do we exist? What's our niche? What's our investor pitch right now? What's our 5-year plan? And then how does that back down into a product philosophy that we can use to prioritize every single feature that we have in our backlog right now? And then we turn that into a manual process. So we say, all right, let's pretend technology didn't exist, right? What could we do? And how could we build this product so that a human could run it? And once we have that in place, we say, now which pieces of that are best to optimize? So maybe we're optimizing for the client. Maybe we're optimizing for the vendor, right? Maybe we're optimizing for staff. What are the pros and the cons of each of those options? And how can we really focus our product line to prove one specific outcome? This is super important in the beginning part of a product roadmap, but it's also important as you start to prioritize new feature development. So let's say you have an MVP up and running and you're thinking about what the phase 2 of your product looks like. This can be a really nice way to direct your growth and align it with everything else happening across your business, and make sure that you're not just spending dollars because you've heard feedback come in, but rather that it's fully aligned with proving out a specific term from your business and proving out a specific KPI. So in summary, first piece of advice is focus in on what you're doing. This is the quickest way to save money, is to focus on one thing and to do that thing super, super well. And so if you are looking to build on a budget, that is the first phase. Get your hypotheses straight and make sure everyone on your company is aligned with those. Phase 2 is design and scoping. So this is where we get out of kind of business requirements and into product requirements. At this point, you have decided that you're going to push forward one specific hypothesis at your company. And what you're going to do is put together a list of 100 different ways that you could really improve that hypothesis using product management and product development, right? And there are 3 different ways that we help our companies design and scope so that we're staying in a smaller budget, making sure that we're not building sort of, the next Uber, but rather what Uber was 15 years ago when it started. And so there are 3 different things that we focus on. The first is called what we call the loop. And the second is user journeys and outcomes. And then the third is really homing in on those requirements and forcing them even narrower than you think that they could be. So the first is what we call the loop here at ThinkNimble. This is essentially a diagram that visualizes how the product process works. So you get a set of information that comes in from your user, and this helps you figure out, what should we build? What are users asking for? What do we think that this product is really going to help us achieve? And then we design that and go through a prioritization process. So we say, is this really important? Is this something we really need to do? And we kick that back out to a developer to see if there's an estimate we can provide on that. Sometimes that makes it come back into the prioritization process, right? If this is really going to be a 3-week thing, do we really need to do it? Is there a faster way to do it? How can we better provide the outcomes that we're seeking based on this information that we're receiving back from developers? So this is what we call the loop. It can be really useful for just aligning everybody in your budgeting process to figure out, if we have $30,000 to build this first product, how can we best use that money? And how can we figure out what are the highest leverage opportunities for our improvement? I saw a quick question come in about kind of like products versus services. This really works across the board in terms of, there's a service-based business that focuses in on how connecting people, basically, right? And I'm using the term product to really mean application, so web application or mobile app. But I think generally this process really applies globally to businesses and business management and figuring out, how to focus your whole team across the board. And I also saw a quick question about the range of cost for building a product. I mean, there is no upper limit of that range. I think for your MVP, you should be shooting for somewhere between $30,000 and $65,000. And sometimes it's easier to think of that in terms of time. So in terms of your MVP, 3 to 6 months would be a first release. And you're going to be looking at a really minimum product there. Within a year, you should have something that feels relatively advanced. And that's what part of this loop is helping you do, is figure out, how can we get something out the door back to our customers so that we can continue down this process. Then once you have that in place, it's really important to start trimming down your must-have list so that you're doing only a few things really well instead of doing many things poorly. A lot of our clients come to us and say, these are the 300 things that we want to do. And they're all really, really good ideas. And they really are all important. But there are some that are more important than others. And so it's important that you look back at your hypothesis and use that as a guiding light for your journey, your user journey through your application, and make sure that you are actually focused in on the highest leverage activities that you can do. So we use this example with some of our clients who are less familiar with the product process in terms of what fidelity and scope means. But the idea is that a lot of times our clients come to us and they say, if we're translating this out of the world of technology into the world of, everyday language, and they say, I need an outfit tonight. And our developers come to that and they say, yeah, that's great. You definitely need an outfit for tonight. But that doesn't give them any indication of what that outfit should be like. Should it be fancy? Should it be for the beach? Is it warm out? Is it cold out, etc.? And so the scope of that request is really, really broad. So the fidelity of what you're going to get back or the results are going to be really, really low. And so what we tell our clients to do is to be really clear and specific about what they need and why, what the outcomes that they're seeking from that need are. So instead of saying, I need an outfit for tonight, you say, it is 35 degrees outside. I need a dress for an occasion that is black tie, optional, and I need it to be in this amount of money, right? That gives someone the ability to come back with the exact thing that you're looking for. And I think that can really help in terms of communication of your budget, is figuring out how do you communicate your budget so that people understand specifically what you're looking for and what would be an acceptable bar for that outcome. And that's what we call scoping down your requirements, to be specific. So sometimes that can be helpful to just think outside of the product realm so that you're not speaking in jargon with devs all the time. But this can be a nice way to think through, is this clear enough? Could someone actually provide me with this outcome? And then from there, what you should do is create these user journeys, right? So the goal is that from a day one where you meet your user through day churn, whenever your user leaves your site, what can they do? How often do you want them to come back through that loop? What are they capable of in different steps? And what is possible for V1 versus V2, 7, et cetera. And this is called a user journey. I'm sure that you guys have all heard of this, but this is my favorite example of a user journey. So oftentimes we have clients come to us and they say, look, we're trying to build a car. And the way that they think about building a car is like building a wheel and then building the axle and then putting on the outside. And then finally you can drive the car, right? But the way that you should be thinking, and this is the way you can stay on budget, is really this user just wants to move a little faster, right? So the quickest way to do that is to build a skateboard. Maybe that takes a week. With the skateboard, they're not really getting what they want, but they did move a little faster. So we're going to put a handlebar on top, right? And then it turns into a bicycle. And we just slowly get closer to a car. And it doesn't necessarily look exactly like where we wanted it to go, but along the way, we've provided something on time and on budget. And so this example just has always stuck with me in terms of what it means to simplify and to take something that it seems really big and hard to break down, and to break it into a tiny chunk because you're redefining what is happening in terms of the user experience with that thing, not because of, the actual outcome or the UI mockups that you've put together, but rather what can a user do today that they couldn't do yesterday? And that is the best way to keep both devs and yourself on budget. And then I'm sure, again, this is probably a little bit too junior for some of y'all, but once you come up with a user journey, we translate that into low fidelity mockups. So on a specific page, how do you get a user to accomplish the thing that you're seeking to accomplish? And again, every time you do one of these things, you should point back to your hypothesis and say, look, we're testing whether this user will be able to effectively find what they're seeking on this page. Done. I can see there's a filter here that meets all of our requirements. Low fidelity mockups can be a good way to scrap out different pieces that you don't really need before you start investing time in what the user experience is or what the user interface is. So this is a really nice place to trim scope, to cut budget, and kind of keep things on track. And then high fidelity mockups are what you get when you say, okay, now I really want to know what we're going to build, right? I want to know, what are the colors going to be? How sharp is this going to be? How much money are we investing in the user interface versus the user experience versus the back end? And how can we kind of make sure that this fits my aesthetic as a business? High fidelity mockups are oftentimes where people start when they're trying to figure out what to spend on a product. And they are honestly the least important part of defining what your overall product journey is. They're super important because it's what an end client interacts with, but they're less important from a overall budget perspective, because so much goes behind those mock-ups and is hidden in them. And so you can get really tied into, you know, what does this look like instead of what does this do? And does it do the things that are going to change the outcomes of my business? And then the last piece is just making sure that you understand, the data that goes behind all of those mock-ups. So making sure that your requirements are totally scoped down, and that you can help people, your developers, understand how do all of these different pieces relate to each other? What do different pieces need to know about other pieces of the site? And this data modeling exercise can just make sure that, one, you're not going to find any surprises. So a lot of times when we turn from UI mockups into data, we find surprises. So we find 10 new screens we need to build. We find that we've uncovered this whole other user type that needs different permission levels. And that's a place where your budget can just balloon, right? Because you have to go back through and build in permissions, and maybe they weren't built before, et cetera. So if you start here and make sure that you've thought through all of the relationships beforehand, it can really help you keep everything on track and on budget. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly run through the chat, just make sure we're answering questions as we go. Cool, so yeah, there's a couple of questions in here about ranges. Again, if you can develop yourself, right, it's free. So there's anything from free to $1 million that you can spend on an MVP. And I think the question is more about, like, how long do you need to spend and what is the expertise that you need? And that can help you kind of direct your budget appropriately. We also have a question about how big is a team for a project. That totally varies. I mean, so when we started our startup, we had a team of 3, and we had 1 developer and 1 product manager and then an operations person. That was plenty for what we were trying to build. We currently have a team of 11 at ThinkNimble, and we're kind of actively building 4 to 5 different projects at a time. So it can be relatively scoped down, but I think it can be helpful to have the different expertises in the room. Great. So phase 3. So now we've decided really why we're building what we're building, and we've decided what we're building, and we've gone through that 4 to 5 times to make sure we actually need to build those things, right? So now we start getting into the building phase. So I've put the build as phase 4 because I think that it's super important that as you head into a build, you think through what does it mean to let go of this product and to kind of let it create itself, right? So what are your users really looking for, and how important is perfection versus getting something out the door? This is a conversation we have all the time with clients because you're used to interacting with things like Google or like Facebook or like Instagram. And so you think that that is what an MVP looks like. And while it can be what an MVP, sort of like the skin of it, right? It can be beautiful. Those products took multiple years to build and huge teams of thousands of people. And so it's really important that you get your expectations in line for what it looks like to launch a product on a budget, and figure out, if you are solving a problem for your users, they will become your evangelicals. They will be people who talk about how amazing the product is. They will post about it online. They'll bring all their friends to it. They will tell all of their friends about the services you're providing. They will not ever stop talking about it, right? And it doesn't have to be beautiful. So I think my favorite example of this is You Need a Budget, or YNAB. YNAB is a giant company. And they have invested, until recently, they invested very, very little in the actual like interface that people were working with, because it wasn't important to their users. Their users needed better support from banking integrations and needed things like reminders in place, right? And so they spent all of their time on what their users actually wanted and needed, and not what it looked like. And I think that created a really successful product. But if they had gotten bogged down in the UI, they could have been really over budget and potentially offline from what their folks were looking for. So I would say definitely make sure you know what your users are seeking, make sure you're looking to solve their problems specifically, and then let everything else go. And then the last piece of feedback from this section is that users always have critical feedback, and it's great. It's how you continue to grow, and it's how you continue to improve your product. But getting something shipped is always better than getting something perfect. And so sometimes you'll say, you know, this page is kind of hard to use, but I think people can use it. So let's go ahead and move forward, and then let's add that to the next round. We find that a lot of our clients get stuck in this feedback loop, and they don't want to launch until they think it's perfect. But if they would just get something out the door, they would figure out specifically what they need to work on next. And so it can be really hard to do, but it's a really important skill for keeping your project on budget and on time. So then finally we move into the build. So I have a ton of slides in here about, you know, what, like different ways to build this process. So that's in the who to trust section, in terms of there's a million ways to get a product built, right? And there's a ton of people who can code these days. So we'll kind of speed through those. And then if there are people who have specific questions at the end, we can come back to them. And then the last piece is just scoping and budgeting as you go, and consistently pointing yourself back to that hypothesis and being able to move forward and let things go as you start to build. So we work with a ton of folks whose first option was outsourcing their development to an overseas development shop. If that's something that you've thought about doing, it can be an awesome option. We have worked with a bunch of developers overseas ourselves, and so many of them are super talented. But the quality that they provide is totally across the board. It can be amazing or it can be terrible. And I think it's really important that you quickly review all the code that comes in and raise issues with your developer or their manager in order to keep that on track. So if you don't have a developer in-house who can read the code, it's important to kind of figure out someone who could, or at least be able to kind of run it through, you know, maybe someone on Upwork that you just kind of contract with, or someone you trust. And then also that you're rapidly testing it. So if it's working on the front end, then you can probably assume that it's fine in terms of just getting an MVP up and out the door. In terms of speed, overseas shops are often very quick because they're able to focus in really, really narrowly, right? You kind of define the expectations for them quite narrowly. But the way to make sure that they don't get caught in a loop where they're just redesigning something for you consistently is to be clear and concise, and then have them kind of repeat back any questions or things that they have. So we found that when we were working with our overseas devs, having very clear mockups that connected to one another through clicks was the best way to make sure that it looked like what we expected at the end of the day. There was a question about Fiverr. Those types of things I think are great. Like Upwork, Fiverr, overseas, all those things are really great ways to find devs. The most important thing you can do is to have someone on your team that you trust that either can review their code or become a really great product manager yourself, so that you understand how the code should work. So if the code is producing the outcomes that you're seeking, then it's a great solution. You know, whether or not it's stable or you're able to kind of build on top of it down the line is a question for your budget. But if you feel like it's doing what it needs to do, then it's probably a great solution for an MVP. One of the other drawbacks for overseas shops is time zones. We were on a completely flipped schedule from our devs, so that could be really tough to get feedback in place without like a 4-day cycle kind of around it. So it's just something to keep in mind. And consistently, those developers were being flipped out of projects, right? They have a ton of projects that they're trying to cycle through. And so good documentation is something to potentially pay more for, to make sure that, one, your devs are documenting what they're doing, and two, that your team is documenting the outcomes that you're seeking. That can be a really, really helpful way to make sure that things don't move as new talent comes in, but rather you keep things moving forward. And then again, language barriers. This is typically not a problem with the overseas shops anymore, but make sure that you're really clear about communication tools. There is a difference between outsourcing product management and then outsourcing tech development. Outsourcing product management can be difficult because someone else has to take your idea and translate it into how it works. So figuring out how to keep your product team kind of really tightly integrated with the rest of your team is a really important step. And then outsourcing that technology piece can be broken apart from outsourcing product management. And then, again, these are kind of just quick ideas. Assessing the skill level of your firm instead of just the individuals on your project, they'll likely change. If you can visit the country that you're outsourcing to, we found that that's really great. There's a bunch of really great shops in Costa Rica that have been on our radar recently. And then make sure that your main point of contact can explain back to you what you're seeking to do. So your main point of contact, you should have no illusions that they don't understand the outcomes that you're seeking. They should be able to basically step in for you if you were sick for a day, right? They should be able to say all of the same things that you would say. And that's a super important way to be sure that what you'll get at the end of this investment is something that you were seeking at the beginning. And then finally, I think it's important that you treat them like team members. So whoever's working on your dev project, they should be involved in stand-ups. They should be getting updates about sales. Even if they're not responding to them, it's really important that you think of your product as a piece of your business, not just as something that happens on the side and then comes back in and runs your business, but rather kind of part of the cohesive pieces that are moving the needle on your business. The last piece here is it's okay to pull the plug on individuals and contracts. I think sometimes we feel like because we decided that something was going to work, that we need to finish out where, we need to see how the experiment ends up. And I think there's something to be said for that, but it's also okay to say, I'm no longer comfortable with how this is going. I need a pause. I need to figure out if this is something I want to do. And I think that can be really useful. All right, so quick questions here. Open source technology, huge fan. That's what we use here at ThinkNimble. Always, I think there's a lot to be learned from open source technology. And then in terms of the stress being high, being like a product manager and the CEO and the founder and raising funds and blah, 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 I totally hear that. I think that's the hardest part of being in startups, is that it's sort of a lonely journey, but it's also a lonely journey that has a lot of demands on you. And so one, finding someone who can do the pieces of your job that are repeatable or scalable is really important. So your job should be to replace yourself every 6 months, right? Figure out how to do something really well and then hand it off to a new team member or to a software or something like that. That can be a really nice way to alleviate that stress. And the second one is just to build a group of people around you that you trust and that are going through something similar. So the job of a product manager and the job of a CEO are not that different. The job is to identify an end goal and kind of figure out how to get there. So if you can find a way to identify someone with those same skill sets and then hand off the product to them, that's a great opportunity. And then again, there's a bunch of resources out there of people who are really, really talented in this arena, and finding some of them for your team can be a good solution as well. So I'm going to kind of breeze through a lot of this, but we've worked with a bunch of different styles of coding, right? And two examples that I just wanted to highlight are, we work with a client called EdSites. She was a student at Georgetown when she started her company, and she found herself running an investment kind of track, running a developer that she had contracted who was a student at the time. She was running a full course load, and she was trying to decide if this was something she was going to do full time. So the pro of this was that it was a really cheap experience. She found a student who was willing to take equity in her company and a couple $1,000s to build an MVP, and that was awesome. But the trade-off was that it was very slow. This person treated it like a part-time job because it was. And I think you can find yourself really split and kind of serving two masters at this point, and it can make it hard to iterate quickly enough alongside your customers to get something successful out the door. This person also didn't have a long-term plan in place, right? So if this person graduates or moves on, what do you do with your product? What do you do with the pieces of code that person has built? And it kind of gets you something really quickly on budget, really, really nicely, but it can become a larger budget project in total, because you don't have the continuity that you need. And so one of the things just to think about is, as you put your first budget in place, how does that play in with your overall budget and time frame? And is it worth the trade-off of cash or equity today in order to make sure that the overall budget stays on track and on time? And then our company Aspire that we ran a couple of years ago, we had a CTO by night. He was like amazingly talented, super amazing, but he had another day job. And we were working all day on this one product, and it just kind of became clear that he wasn't able to translate the needs of the business as quickly as if he had been full-time. And so we spent a lot of time taking business needs and translating them into tech needs. And so it saved us money up front, but the product requirement or the product roadmap suffered because it wasn't able to keep pace with what we were learning day over day in our startup. And so once we brought him on full time, we found that kind of rebalanced and we were able to move quickly. So I think that it can seem really nice to save money up front and to do a low cost, low budget MVP, but a lot of times you end up paying for that over the first 3 years of your business. And it can be better to invest a little bit more up front to really fully be sure and feel like you've tested all of your options before moving forward. So I'm going to switch through these. Again, we can come back to these if anyone has questions. But basically the way to evaluate who should build your app is, how complex is this app? Is it built on the blockchain? Is it something that you definitely need an expert in? Or is it something where you can learn to code yourself, or you could find a buddy who codes and kind of give them the ability to help you launch this product quickly? And then who do you know? Who's available in the marketplace? Who are you able to trust, and who can you kind of talk through all of these ideas with? And then balancing that with the available equity and cash that you have is the best way to help make that decision, right? So figuring out, maybe a cash balance right now is the best way for you to move forward because you think that your equity is going to be really valuable in a year. It can be really great then to pay an agency to do this work really quickly because you'll be able to test kind of the long-term prospects of your business. But if you're not sure about that, maybe equity is the way to go now, kind of find a partner and move forward with an equity-based contract right now, and then conserve cash for down the road when you're looking to grow from there. So this is sort of the way that we help our clients evaluate whether they should be looking for an in-house tech team, an out-house tech team, those types of choices. And the budget that you decide on is very responsive to this decision. So it can be something that's definitely worth spending time on. Cool. So phase 5 is the launch of your product. So now you've invested the time, you've kind of put together a budget, you've handed it off to the devs, you've consistently scoped as you're going through that process to make sure that you're staying on budget. You've pointed back to your hypothesis at every point along the way to say, this is what we're trying to test. So if this is taking too long, cut it because it's not part of our hypothesis. And then once you're ready to go live, there are 3 different things that you should have in place before then that can help you make sure that the budget that you set aside is most effectively used. So the first is that you should have a go-to-market plan. So you should have a person, like at the beginning of this process, you should be able to say, we're going to launch on this date. Here's how we're going to generate interest. Here's how we're going to make sure that we have our marketing tools in place. Here's how we're going to make sure that we're finding our first 500 customers. And that should coincide with the build phase. So as they're spending 3 months building your product, you should be spending 3 months building up demand for that product and making sure that everything is ready to go on the day you kind of turn the key. So don't fall into the mindset of if you build it, they will come, because most likely they won't. And also, then you'll have budgeted this whole thing and really honed in on what you can afford, and there won't be anyone there to kind of pick up the slack. The second thing is just testing with your whole crew. So we always say that your mom is your biggest cheerleader sometimes in this, right? She can't find anything wrong with your business idea, But if you put an application or a product or a service in front of her, she will definitely find something wrong with it. And so one of the things that we love to do is just identify folks who are not typical app users, right? Identify someone who doesn't understand how something should work, and have them try to break your application. And that can give you really good feedback in terms of help topics you need to write things on, maybe different ways you should introduce this to different types of clients, different things you need to be doing on a hands-on way with your first clients to make sure that your launch is successful. And then the last piece is just analyzing your outcomes. So from the beginning, you set out a hypothesis that you were testing against, and you should be able to say at the end of that, this outcome was achieved. So if your hypothesis is that investors will create better relationships with other investors, maybe the outcome that you're seeking is that investors have increased their LinkedIn connections by 5, right? That's a dumb one, but let's pretend that was it. You should be analyzing that outcome from day one to point back to your hypothesis and tell your investors, tell your sales team, tell your marketing team, that's what we intended to do. And our product improved our ability to do that by X percentage. And so what we're going to do is double down on that. We're going to make these features better. We're going to reinvest our budget into this piece. And having that analysis kind of laid out at the beginning can help you do a better job budgeting as you're going through, because you're able to consistently point back to, is this moving the needle on that thing that we identified as important. Cool. All right. So those are kind of the key steps that we walk our clients through at ThinkNimble. Figuring out what to build, figuring out the quickest way to build it, starting that build with an ideal of, these are the things that are super important to our team. So let's focus in on those. And then building those in an iterative way so that we're consistently making sure that our attention is on the most important pieces. And then finally testing the outcomes of that build. If you guys have questions on that, I would love to take them now. I've been seeing a couple come in, so I'll run through them. But if you have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I will start going through them. Cool. So what should you do if when you're getting users to sign up for your services, but no one is using the services? So this is sort of it was easy to attract interest, but perhaps you're having trouble translating them into full users of your app. Typically that means that something in your user experience is off. So they thought they were going to get something, which is why they signed up, and that thing isn't coming through. So I would go talk to those users and say, look, when you came here, what were you expecting to get? Kind of give them 5 or 6 things. Depending on that, ask what they saw when they got to your product. And if those 2 things don't match up, figure out what the branching point is in between them that could make them match up. It sounds to me like users are expecting something and getting something else. And that's not necessarily bad. You just need to align those 2 things so that they can move forward effectively. I'm happy to distribute these slides. They are, just so beautiful. I'm sure everybody will use them forever. But if you just shoot me an email at marcy@thinknimble.com, I'm happy to shoot you over the slides. Cool. Determining a set of timelines or getting a sense for how long a project should take. So this is a big question that we get from clients relatively frequently. If anyone tells you with specificity that something will take X amount of time, they are probably discounting a lot of factors and features of the world that kind of come in to mess with that. And so typically what we do with our clients is say, look, in 4 months, in 6 months, we could get you something set up that will allow your users to do X. The specifics of how that X will happen can change over time based on feedback from your users, based on changes that your investors are seeking, or based on things that we learned during the technical build. But what we can do is just make sure that there's a consistent release point, and then we can adjust features and fidelity from there. So we talk about a triangle trade-off where there's a trade-off between scope, budget, and timeframes. So something that we found is helpful is kind of locking in a launch date and changing what goes into that launch date based on things that we're learning from the outside world. And that makes sure that you have something that's usable, testable, something you can ship to your customers by that point, but kind of forces you to do that skateboard mentality behind the scenes. So that can be a really nice way to do that, and to kind of get those timelines in place. And then as things get more specific, so as you get down to the feature level, so like, I want this button to live here and go to this page, that should be something that a developer is able to give you an estimate on. Even if it's like a week versus a half week, you can kind of ask for those different types of estimates. Determining pricing for working with clients. So personally at ThinkNimble, we work on a weekly model where we like staff developers on client projects, because we think that the mentality of a developer should match the mentality of a CEO. So you should be fully invested in kind of like the outcomes that you're seeking from a week. And so pricing is variable based on the skill of the developer coming in, the total overhead of the shop and the firm that you're looking to work with, or the individual, right? But I think typically pricing is determined by length of time and kind of like how specific something is. And so it can be a moving target, but I think if you come with a budget and you say, look, I've raised X amount of money, I want to spend 40% of it on marketing and I want to spend 40% of it on product, you can find a way to make the user outcome that you're seeking work within that budget. So typically I'd say like work backwards from your budget into what you can build instead of forwards from what you can build into your budget. Cool. And no, feel free to shoot me a note. We'll happily sit down and brainstorm with anyone who was on this call about, what you're trying to build, if we think it's feasible, other things we might suggest you reach out to. We have some connections with smaller firms or individual developers as well. So if there's a better solution for you, we're happy to point you in the right direction. But we love brainstorming sessions. We, I think that we'll kind of find that the best way for our startups to succeed is to have a ton of startups around them who are doing a lot of, mind sharing and kind of helping them figure out the best way forward. And so any of those brainstorms we'll happily do for free. Just shoot me a note at marcy@thinknimble.com. I think that's all the questions. Anything else, feel free to shoot me a note and we will happily chat. But yeah, I think that's it. Corey, if you wanna take back over here.
Yeah, it sounds great. Thank you so much, Marcy. That was a fantastic discussion on building, testing, and shipping your product on a budget. We really appreciate your time and the support of the DC Startup Week community today. Feel free, of course, like Marcy said, reach out. Marcy, did you put your email in the chat yet?
I did not, but let me do so, and I will.
Perfect. And we have actually 4 different talks coming up here at the 3 o'clock hour with some big hitters, which we're really excited about. We have Maximize Your LLC, Tips on Taxes and Retirement. We've got Fireside Chat, Optimizing Operations for Greater Team Wellbeing. We've actually got Susan Tynan, the founder of FrameBridge, on that talk, along with Zaria Scott Washington, the EVP of Expedia. So that's going to be a really great chat. We also have, so you want to build a mobile app and building a better startup. So feel free, put any insights you learned from this talk on the activity feed. We'd love to see what you guys learned. Check out the schedule for the 3 o'clock and I will see you guys soon.
Thanks, Corey.